She tried to make decisions about my husband's surgery before I'd even sat down in the waiting room. The form authorizing her was 8 years old. My name is Camille Oyelaran. I'm 38 years old, and I work in HR and benefits administration for a regional hospital system here in Nashville, Tennessee. I want to be specific about what that job actually involves, because it matters enormously to how this story unfolds. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a doctor. I don't make clinical decisions, and I never have. But I spend my entire professional life inside the administrative bloodstream of a hospital system, onboarding paperwork, employee benefits, insurance coordination, and yes, a significant amount of work adjacent to patient intake documentation, because in a large health system, HR and patient records intersect more than people realize, especially around compliance training, how intake forms are supposed to be handled, updated, and audited. I know in granular, unglamorous detail exactly how a piece of paper signed 8 years ago is supposed to be reviewed, updated, and in some cases physically destroyed once it's no longer accurate. I know this because teaching other people to know it is, in a real sense, part of my job. Like and subscribe the channel and tell us in comments from where you are watching this video. I tell you this not to make myself sound impressive, but because on the worst morning of my marriage so far, this specific, boring professional knowledge was the only thing standing between my husband and a piece of outdated paperwork that very nearly let his mother make life or death decisions about his body without my name anywhere in the room. This is the story of how my mother-in-law, Camille Oyelaran Weston, quietly held on to a legal authority over her adult son for 4 years past the day he got married, and how I found out about it in a pre-op hallway, with my husband already in a gown, an IV already in his arm, and a surgeon standing between us asking, very calmly, whose name was actually supposed to be on the form. I should tell you about Patricia first, because none of what happened in the hospital makes sense without understanding the woman at the center of it. And I don't think she's a cartoon villain. I think she's something more familiar and more complicated than that, which is a woman who built her entire identity around being indispensable to her son, and who experienced every other person who became important to him as a kind of slow demotion she never agreed to. Julian, my husband, is an only child. His father left when Julian was 4, and Patricia raised him alone in a small house outside Murfreesboro, working 2 jobs for most of his childhood to keep them afloat. I want to give her real credit here, because it's true and because it matters. She did an extraordinary job raising a kind, thoughtful, emotionally available man under genuinely difficult circumstances, largely by herself, without much support. Julian doesn't have a complicated relationship with his mother in the way a lot of people. He loves her, uncomplicatedly, the way you love someone who sacrificed visibly and consistently for you when you were too young to understand the cost of it. But there's a version of single-parent devotion. If it doesn't evolve once the child becomes an adult, calcifies into something closer to possession than love. Not because the parent is malicious, but because the entire architecture of their identity was built around being the one person their child needed most, and nobody ever sat them down and helped them build a second identity for the chapter of life that comes after that's no longer true. I think that's what happened with Patricia. For 18 years, she was Julian's entire support system. Then he went to college, and she had to learn to be something slightly different, still essential, but no longer singular. She managed that transition reasonably well, by Julian's account. What she never managed well, not once, in the 4 years I'd known her before any of this happened, was the transition to me. I met Julian when we were both 29, through mutual friends at a dinner party in East Nashville. He was easy to talk to in a way that felt immediately rare, present, curious, the kind of person who asks a follow-up question because he's actually interested in the answer, not because he's waiting for his turn to talk again. We dated for 2 years before getting married, and those 2 years, I watched Patricia perform a specific, recurring move that I came to recognize the way you recognize weather patterns. Anytime Julian and I reached a new level of seriousness, moving in together, getting engaged, picking a wedding date, Patricia would respond, within days, with some version of involvement in his medical or financial life that had nothing to do with the actual milestone. When we got engaged, she suddenly wanted to be added back onto his auto insurance policy in case anything happens, you never know. When we set our wedding date, she brought up, unprompted, that Julian should probably update his beneficiary information at job, which, to be fair, is reasonable financial advice in the abstract, except that the conversation always seemed to end with her offering to come along to make sure it got done, rather than simply mentioning it and stepping back. I didn't think much of any single instance of this at the time. Parents worry, mothers in particular, often worry in slightly intrusive, well-intentioned ways that don't necessarily indicate anything sinister. There were other small examples, too, scattered across those 2 years of dating, that on their own looked like nothing. Patricia showing up unannounced at Julian's apartment with soup when he had a minor cold, which is sweet on its face, except she also used the visit to reorganize his medicine cabinet and ask pointed questions about whether I was taking good care of him. Patriciaing, the one time Julian sprained his ankle playing pickup basketball, on being the one to drive him to urgent care even though I was standing right there, available, 20 minutes closer. None of it, taken individually, would have struck anyone as alarming. Taken together, over 2 years, it built a picture I didn't fully see the shape of until much later. A woman who treated every moment of physical vulnerability in her son's life as an invitation to reassert a role she felt was rightfully, permanently hers. What I didn't fully appreciate, what I don't think anyone fully appreciates until they're standing in a hospital hallway watching it play out at the worst possible moment, was that Patricia wasn't just worrying out loud. She was, in a slow, almost administrative way, working to keep certain pieces of formal authority over her son's life in her own name, even as his actual life moved further and further away from needing her in that specific capacity. And there was one piece of paper, signed years before I ever met either of them, that she had never once mentioned to me, and that Julian himself had apparently forgotten existed. When Julian was 26, 3 years before we met, 5 years before we married, he'd had an outpatient procedure to repair a torn meniscus in his knee, the kind of minor, scheduled surgery thousands of people have every week without it becoming a significant moment in their lives. He was single at the time, living alone, and when the intake coordinator at the surgical center asked him to fill out a standard patient intake packet, like most outpatient surgical intake packets, included a section for an emergency contact and a section asking whether he wanted to designate a healthcare proxy in case something unexpected happened under anesthesia. Julian, what an enormous number of single 26-year-olds do in that exact moment. He didn't think about it very hard. He wrote down his mother's name, 'cause she was the obvious answer, the person he'd have called regardless, the person who'd driven him to the appointment and was sitting in the waiting room at that very moment. He signed it. The form went into his file. The surgery went fine. He went home that same afternoon with his mother driving him, exactly as planned, and as far as Julian was concerned, that form had served its single, narrow purpose on that single afternoon, and had no further relevance to his life. What Julian didn't know, what almost nobody outside healthcare administration fully understands, is that a healthcare proxy designation on an intake form doesn't expire just because the surgery it was attached to is over. Once that information is entered into a patient's chart within a health system, it tends to persist as the system's designation of record for that patient unless it's actively, deliberately updated or revoked, either by the patient filling out a new form or by the patient verbally, explicitly changing the designation in a documented way, ideally with witness or notarization, the next time they're admitted anywhere in that same health system. It's not automatically refreshed. It's not automatically questioned. It just sits there, in a chart, waiting for the next moment someone pulls it up. This is, I should say, an entirely reasonable design choice on the part of hospital systems, even though it produces exactly the kind of trap Julian and I fell into. A hospital has no way of knowing, on its own, that a patient's marital status changed, that a relationship ended, that a person who once mattered enormously to a patient's life no longer does. The hospital can only act on what it's told, by the patient, in writing, through the proper channel. The responsibility for keeping that information current sits entirely with the patient, which is a fair system in theory, and a quietly dangerous one in practice, because almost nobody thinks about medical paperwork from a forgotten outpatient procedure 5 years in their past until the exact moment they suddenly, urgently need to. In my professional training, we sometimes talk about the handful of life events that should automatically trigger someone to revisit their advance directive paperwork. A new diagnosis, a decline in health, a divorce, the death of whoever was previously designated, and marriage, somewhat conspicuously, isn't always even formally on that list in patient education materials, despite being exactly the kind of life change that renders an old designation obsolete. I'd argue it should be. I certainly argue it now, every chance I get, to anyone who will listen. Julian had no reason to think about this, ever, because Julian had no reason to expect he'd need a proxy form again any time soon, and certainly no reason to think about updating a piece of paperwork from a single afternoon surgery years in his past. He met me 3 years later. We dated for 2 years. We got married 4 years after that surgery, in a wedding with 200 guests, where Patricia gave a perfectly gracious mother of the groom toast that made several people cry, where she hugged me afterward and told me, with what appeared to be real warmth, that she was happy Julian had found someone who made him laugh the way I did. There was no reason for either of us, me, Julian, Patricia, anyone, to think, in that moment, about a 5-year-old knee surgery form sitting dormant in a hospital record system 40 minutes from where we were dancing. And Patricia never mentioned it. Not at the wedding, not the 4 years that followed. Not once, in any conversation I ever had with her, did she say the words, "I'm still listed as Julian's medical proxy from his old knee surgery. Should we talk about updating that now that you two are married?" I want to be precise about what I can and can't actually know here, because I think honesty matters more than drama in a story like this. I cannot tell you with certainty whether Patricia consciously, deliberately decided to let that old designation sit unspoken because some part of her wanted to retain that authority, or whether she simply never thought about it either, the same way Julian never thought about it, the same administered blind spot affecting 2 people instead of 1. What I can tell you is what she did once that old, dormant form suddenly, unexpectedly became relevant again. And what she did, in that moment, told me everything I needed to know about which of those two explanations was actually true. 8 months ago, Julian started having abdominal pain that came and went, mild enough at first that he assumed it was something he'd eaten, persistent enough, after a few weeks, that I finally got him to see a doctor about it. What followed was a few months of escalating tests. An ultrasound, then a CT scan, then a referral to a gastrointestinal surgeon, that eventually produced a diagnosis neither of us had been expecting going in: a benign but significant mass that needed to come out, attached closely enough to surrounding tissue that the surgery to remove it carried real risk, the kind of risk that required pre-surgical consultation about complications, about what would happen if something went wrong on the table, about exactly the kind of scenario that healthcare proxy forms exist to prepare for in the place. I remember the appointment where Dr. Price first laid out the risk profile for us, in detail, in a small consultation room with diagrams on a screen. The percentage chance of complication, the specific structures near the mass that made this more delicate than a routine removal, the standard conversation every surgeon has before a procedure carrying meaningful risk. He used the phrase, "in the unlikely event we need someone to make a decision on your behalf mid-procedure," almost in passing, the way surgeons do, because for them it's a routine part of informed consent rather than a dramatic warning. I remember nodding along at the time, filing the phrase away as standard pre-op language, never once connecting it to a 5-year-old form I didn't know existed. I want to describe what those months were actually like, because I think it's important context for understanding why neither Julian nor I thought, even once, to hospital what was on file from his old surgery. We were not thinking administratively. We were thinking about survival, about risk percentages, about what questions to ask the surgeon, about how to tell Julian's mother in a way that wouldn't send her into a spiral, about how to keep our own relationship steady while one of us quietly, privately, was scared in a way neither of us said out loud very often. Julian handled the news with a kind of measured calm that I think surprised both of us. He's not a man who panics easily, and watching him absorb a diagnosis like that with more composure than I managed myself made me love him in a slightly different, more specific way than I had before, the way you sometimes fall in love again with someone in the exact moment you watch them be brave about something hard. We told Patricia together, at her house, about 3 weeks after the diagnosis was confirmed. I remember the conversation clearly because of how immediately, how instinctively she turned toward me with a question that felt, in retrospect, less like concern and more like an audit. "Have you talked to the surgeon yet? Has Julian signed anything? Who's listed on his paperwork?" I told her honestly that we just started the process, that we hadn't gotten into the administrative details yet, that we were still absorbing the diagnosis itself. She nodded, but I remember the specific quality of her nod. Quick, already moving past my answer toward some internal calculation of her own. The same quality I'd later recognize, with much more clarity, standing in a pre-op hallway months later. In hindsight, I think that was the moment Patricia checked, somewhere in the back of her mind, what was already on file from the knee surgery years earlier, and decided, consciously or not, I still can't say for certain which, that she didn't need to bring it up, because it was already exactly she wanted it to be. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early, a 6:30 a.m. check-in time, the kind of pre-dawn hospital arrival makes the whole experience feel slightly unreal, fluorescent lights and empty parking structures, and a kind of hush in the hallways that doesn't exist later in the day. Julian, and I arrived together at 6:15. Patricia, who lived about 40 minutes away, had told us the night before that she'd probably head over too, just to be there. Which neither of us thought much of at the time. Of course she'd want to be there. We'd have been surprised if she hadn't wanted to come. The first hour went the way these mornings usually go. Intake, vitals, a nurse walking Julian through what to expect, helping him change into a gown, starting an IV line in his left forearm, while I sat in a chair pulled close to the gurney, holding his other hand, both of us making the kind of low-stakes, slightly nervous small talk people make in pre-op rooms to avoid. Sitting in silence with what's actually happening. He made a joke about the gown's color, something about how hospital fashion had clearly not evolved since the 1970s, and I laughed harder than the joke actually deserved. Because laughing felt like the only useful thing my body knew how to do with the nervous energy sitting in my chest. A nurse came by twice more to confirm his information, ask him to state his name and date of birth, check the V-line, the same careful, repetitive verification rhythm I knew, from my own work, exists specifically to catch errors before they happen rather than after. Patricia arrived around 7, while a nurse was finishing up Julian's, and settled in the second chair on the other side of the gurney, and for about 20 minutes, the three of us sat together in that small curtained pre-op bay, and it felt, honestly, almost normal, a family. Waiting room moment, slightly tense but unremarkable. Patricia asked Julian how he was feeling, told him she'd brought a book to read in the waiting room, in case it runs long, made a small comment about the temperature of the room. I remember thinking, in that ordinary stretch of small talk, that this was simply going to be a hard, anxious, ultimately uneventful morning, nervous waiting, then surgery, then relief. I had no idea, in that 20 minutes, the next conversation in that room was going to everything I thought I understood about what was actually on file for my husband. Then the surgeon came in to do his final pre-op consultation, and everything changed in about 90 seconds. Dr. Aaron Price was Julian's surgeon, a calm, precise man in his early 50s who'd walked us through the procedure twice already in pre-consultations, and who I'd come to trust specifically because he had a habit of double-checking small details that other physicians, in my professional experience, sometimes skip. He came in with a tablet, pulling up Julian's chart, going through a final verification checklist before they wheeled him back. Allergies, last meal, confirming the surgical site, the standard pre-op verification sequence designed specifically to catch exactly the kind of mistake that, in a hospital, can have serious consequences if it slips through. And then, almost as an aside, in the middle of his checklist, Dr. Price said something that made my entire body go still. And I see here your listed healthcare proxy is your mother, Patricia. Is that still accurate, or has that changed since this was entered? I felt Julian's hand tighten slightly in mine. I watched him blink, processing the question, clearly trying to remember a form he hadn't thought about in 5 years. That's from my knee surgery years ago, he said slowly. I didn't realize that was still on file. Dr. Price nodded, unbothered, the way physicians are trained to be unbothered by administrative wrinkles that happen more often than patients realize. It happens more than you'd think. Older designations sometimes carry forward in the system if they're never formally updated. I just want to confirm who you'd actually want making decisions today. Given the nature of this procedure, since there's a real chance, however small, that we'd need someone to make a call mid-surgery if something unexpected came up. And before Julian could answer, before he'd even finished forming the sentence, I watched him start to build. Patricia spoke. "That's still me," she said, with a kind of easy, practiced confidence that told me, instantly, that this was not a surprise to her in the way it clearly was to Julian and to me. I'm listed because I'm his mother. We've never needed to change it. I want to slow down here, because the next 2 minutes are the part of this story that everything else hinges on, and I want to walk through exactly what I knew, professionally, in that specific moment, because it's the only reason I was able to respond the way I did instead of simply absorbing the shock the way Julian and Dr. Price were both visibly absorbing it. I knew, because it's genuinely part of my job to know, that a healthcare proxy designation is not a permanent appointment that requires some elaborate legal proceeding to change. It's a documented preference, expressed by a competent adult patient, that can be updated at almost any point by the patient themselves, as long as they're conscious, lucid, and capable of clearly stating their wishes, which Julian, sitting upright on that gurney with an IV in his arm but his mind completely clear, absolutely was. I knew that hospitals, specifically because situations like this one happen more often than most people realize, old forms, lapsed designations, family disputes that surface at exactly the wrong moment, generally keep a notary or a designated patient rights officer on staff or on call, specifically to handle exactly this kind of urgent, last-minute documentation update before a procedure. I'd helped coordinate training on this exact protocol for new administrative staff, my own hospital system, less than a year earlier. I knew the form, I knew the process, and I knew, with complete certainty, that the 8-year-old knee surgery document sitting in Julian's chart had exactly zero binding relevance to what either of us actually wanted that morning. But that, until it was formally replaced, it remained the legal designation of record, and if something went wrong on that table before it got replaced, Patricia, not me, would be the one a surgical team turned to. I also knew, with a different kind of certainty, exactly what Patricia was doing in that moment, sitting calmly in her chair, saying, "That's still me," with the easy confidence of someone reciting a fact rather than defending a position. She wasn't confused. She wasn't simply mistaken about an old form she'd forgotten existed. If she had genuinely forgotten, her response to Dr. Price's question would have been surprise. "Oh, is that still on file? We should probably update that." Instead, her response was immediate, settled, already decided, the response of someone who had known exactly what was on that form and had simply never volunteered the information, waiting perhaps for exactly this kind of moment, high stakes, time pressure, surgeon already moving toward the next item on his checklist, where updating it might feel, to everyone else in the room, like more trouble than it was worth. There was a version of that morning, I understood instantly, where this could have gone very differently. If I hadn't worked in hospital administration, if I hadn't known, specifically, that proxy designations can be updated bedside, quickly, by a competent patient, without requiring a lawyer, or a waiting period, or some elaborate legal process. If I'd simply absorbed Patricia's confident, "That's still me," the way an exhausted, frightened spouse with no relevant professional background might reasonably absorb it. As an immovable fact, a piece of bureaucracy too entrenched to challenge 90 seconds before a surgery, something to sort out. Later, after everything was over, I think, if I hadn't known better, I might have let it go in that exact moment. Told myself we'd deal with the paperwork properly once Julian was home and recovered, and trusted that nothing would go wrong in the meantime. That single piece of professional knowledge, the simple fact that this be fixed right now, quickly, cleanly, was the entire difference between a fright anecdote and an actual crisis. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think the instinct in this exact moment. For a lot of people, would have been to turn to your mother-in-law and demand to know what she thought she was doing, and I understand that instinct completely, because I felt it fully in my own chest. But I also understood, with the same clarity I bring to a difficult conversation at work, that the goal in that pre-op bay was not to win an argument with Patricia. The goal was to get the actual, accurate, current designation on file before Julian went back into that operating room. Anything that slowed that process down, including a fight, worked directly against that goal. I turned to Dr. Price instead. Is there someone on staff who can update this right now, before he goes back? I asked. A notary or whoever handles proxy documentation changes. Because this form is from a surgery 5 years before we got married and it's never been updated. Dr. Price looked at Julian, not at Patricia, not at me. The appropriate person to confirm this with, the actual patient still fully capable of speaking for himself. Julian, is that accurate? Has your situation changed since this was filed? Julian said, and his voice was steady in a way that made something in my chest unclench slightly. I got married 4 years ago. I want my wife as my proxy. I should have updated this a long time ago, and I just never thought about it. It's been sitting there since I was 26. What happened next took, by the clock on the wall of that pre-op bay, almost exactly 12 minutes, and I think about those 12 minutes more than almost any other stretch time in my marriage, because they were simultaneously some of the most frightening and administratively mundane minutes I've ever lived through, both at once. In a way it felt almost absurd even as it was happening. Dr. Price paged the unit's patient relations coordinator, a calm, efficient woman named Denise, who arrived within about 4 minutes carrying a small folder of standard forms, exactly the kind of rapid response documentation process I'd known. In the abstract, hospitals maintained for precisely this situation, and that I was now watching, with enormous relief, actually function in real time. Denise explained, briskly and clearly, to Julian directly, what the form would say, what it would mean, and confirmed out loud twice. He understood he was revoking the prior designation and replacing it with a new one, naming me. Julian confirmed both times, clearly, without hesitation. Patricia, to her credit in this one specific moment, did not create a scene. She sat in her chair, arms folded, her expression tight and unreadable, and said nothing while Denise walked Julian through the form. I don't know what she was thinking in those 12 minutes. I've thought about it since, more than I probably should, and I've landed somewhere close to this. I think some part of her understood, watching her sons speak clearly and calmly about a decision that had nothing to do with rejecting her and everything to do with a marriage she'd attended and apparently never fully metabolized, that there was no version of objecting out loud. In that specific moment, in front of a surgeon and a patient relations coordinator, that wouldn't make plain exactly what she'd been doing by staying silent for 4 years. The form itself made the case more clearly than any argument I could have constructed. She didn't need me to accuse of anything. The blank line where her name used to be, and the new line where mine was about to go, did all the talking that needed doing. Denise read the new designation aloud before Julian signed it, the way I understand is standard for exactly this kind of bedside update. Confirming, on the record in front of witnesses, exactly what authority was being granted and to whom, so there could be no ambiguity later about what Julian had actually agreed to. This designates your spouse, Camille Oyelaran, as your healthcare proxy and decision-maker in the event you become unable to communicate your own wishes during this procedure or its aftermath. This supersedes and revokes any prior designation on file, including the one from your 2018 procedure naming Patricia Oyelaran Weston. Do you understand and agree to this change? Julian said yes, clearly looking at me rather than at the form, and something in that specific moment, his eyes on mine instead of on the paperwork, undid something tight in my chest that had been wound since the second Patricia had said, "That's still me." The hospital, as it happened, did keep a notary on staff for exactly this kind of situation, a soft-spoken man named Ruben who covered 3 different units and who Denise reached by phone, arriving at the bedside about 6 minutes after being paged. He verified Julian's identity, watched him sign the new designation, confirmed out loud that Julian appeared alert, competent, and was signing of his own free will, without anyone pressuring him, a step I learned later is specifically built into hospital bedside notarization protocol exactly to prevent situations where a vulnerable, medicated, or anxious patient might be steered toward a decision under pressure from someone in the room. Ruben asked Julian directly, with both Tricia and me present, whether anyone had pressured him into this change. Julian said no, clearly, and added, unprompted, that this was something he'd simply never gotten around to updating, and that he was relieved to finally take care of it before going into surgery. Ruben stamped the form. Denise filed it into Julian's chart immediately on a tablet, while we all watched, so there'd be no gap, no window of time where the old designation could somehow still apply. Dr. Price confirmed, looking at his own screen, that the chart now reflected the update. I asked Ruben, somewhat absurdly given everything happening around us, how often this exact scenario came up. An outdated proxy form surfacing right before a procedure. He told me, with the kind of weary, practiced patience of someone who's answered the question many times, that it happens more often than people would expect, usually with divorces rather than marriages, an ex-spouse still listed years after a separation, nobody having thought to formally revoke it. He said he'd done me a dozen bedside updates just that year for exactly this reason. It was, in its own strange way, a small comfort to learn that our mourning, however frightening it had felt in the moment, was not some unique catastrophe, but a recognized, anticipated failure point that hospitals had quietly built an entire small process around fixing. We weren't the first family this happened to. We were simply lucky enough to catch it in time, with a surgeon thorough enough to ask the question at all. 12 minutes. Start to finish. A form that had sat dormant for 5 years, silently authorizing a woman who had never once mentioned existence, replaced in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, because the hospital had a process built for exactly this, and because Julian, conscious and lucid on a gurney with an IV, already taped into his arm, simply said, clearly, he actually wanted in that role. They wheeled him back about 10 minutes after that. I kissed him before they took him, and the last thing he said to me, half laughing despite everything, was, 8 years, Cam. I can't believe it took 8 years, and almost going into surgery for anyone to notice. And I sat in a waiting room together for the next 3.5 hours. Because, of course we did. There was nowhere else for either of us to be, and leaving would have felt, to both of us, I think, like abandoning Julian in some symbolic way neither of us was willing to risk, even amid everything that had just happened between us. The waiting room itself was the kind of generic, beige, deliberately unremarkable space hospitals built specifically to absorb anxious families without giving them anything sharp-edged to focus their nerves on. Soft chairs, coffee station nobody seemed to be using, a wall-mounted screen tracking, patient status by a code number instead of a name, so that Patricia and I both found ourselves periodically glancing up at patient Faton's pre-op, and then, a while later, patient 14, in surgery, tracking Julian's progress through a number rather than through any actual information, which felt like its own small, strange metaphor for the morning we'd just had. So much of what mattered reduced to a designation on a screen, a label that had nearly determined who got to speak for him. For the first hour, we didn't speak much. I scrolled my phone without really reading anything on it. Patricia sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a muted television mounted in the corner of the waiting room, playing a daytime talk show neither of us was watching. I texted my own mother at one point, briefly, just to have somewhere to put the adrenaline still circulating in my system, and she wrote back something supportive and slightly bewildered. Since I hadn't yet had the chance to explain what had actually happened that morning beyond surgeries underway, we'll update you. About 90 minutes in, Patricia finally spoke, with looking at me. I wasn't trying to take anything away from you. I just never got around to changing it. It wasn't some plot. I considered several different responses in the silence that followed, and I want to be honest that I didn't fully believe her, not completely, not given how infinitely she'd said, "That's still me," back in that pre-op bay, with none of the surprise a person, genuinely caught off guard by an old, forgotten form would have shown. But I also understood, sitting in that waiting room with my husband, somewhere behind a set of double doors having surgery for a mass none of us had asked for, that this was not the moment to relitigate her intentions, and that doing so wouldn't change anything that actually mattered. The form was fixed, the designation was updated, and whatever Patricia had or hadn't consciously intended over the previous 4 years, the practical danger of it was now behind us. "I believe you didn't think about it very often," I said carefully, which was true, and which was also not quite the same thing as believing she'd never thought about it at all. But it should have come up. Years ago, the first time he was admitted anywhere after we got married, it should have come up, from you, before it ever became a question a surgeon had to ask in a pre-op room 10 minutes before he went under anesthesia. Patricia didn't have a response to that. She looked back at the muted television, and we sat in a different, slightly less tense silence for the remainder of the wait. Two women who loved the same man in different, complicated, occasionally competing ways, neither of us willing to manufacture a reconciliation neither of us actually felt. Yet, around the 2.5-hour mark, a different nurse came out to give us a brief update, surgery proceeding as expected. No complications so far, maybe another hour to go, and I watched some of the visible tension leave Patricia's shoulders at the same moment it left mine, the two of us united, at least, in the one thing we'd never disagreed about across any of this, wanting Julian to come out of that room okay. The surgery went well. Dr. Price came out a little after 11 to tell us the mass had been removed cleanly. No complications, recovery would be straightforward, and Julian would be groggy, but fine within the hour. I felt something in my chest that had been clenched since 7:02 that morning finally, fully release. Julian and I talked about all of it about a week after he came home. Once the immediate physical recovery had settled into something more manageable, and he had the bandwidth to actually process what had happened rather than just survive it. He was, in a way I found genuinely moving, more upset on my behalf than on his own. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if something had actually gone wrong in there," he said one evening, sitting on the couch with a blanket over his legs, still moving carefully. "If they'd needed someone to make a call mid-surgery, it would have been her. No. And you have just had to sit there." He shook his head. I should have updated that years ago. I genuinely forgot it existed. But she didn't forget. She couldn't have. She knew exactly what was on that form, and she let it sit there. I told him I agreed, and that I didn't think about a single oversight, mine or his, or even entirely hers. It was about a pattern, the same pattern I'd watched in smaller doses for 4 years, of Patricia, quietly maintaining whatever formal claims on his life she could. Even as the actual shape of his life moved further away from needing her in that specific way, I told him I didn't think she was a villain in some cartoonish sense. I told him I thought she was a woman who'd spent 18 years as the most important person in someone's life and had never quite built a version of herself that knew how to be the second most important person instead, and that the proxy form, more than anything else, was a symptom of that unfinished work rather than a calculated scheme. We talked, too, about what we wanted to do differently going forward. Not just fixing that one form, but actually sitting down, properly, with an attorney to put together a full current set of advance directives, a complete healthcare power of attorney naming me clearly, a living will spelling out his actual wishes in more detail than a rushed bedside form could capture, copies distributed to both our primary care doctors and kept somewhere we'd both remember. We did that within the month, partly because the experience had frightened us both into taking it seriously, and partly because I now understood, with new clarity, just how much can hinge on paperwork nobody thinks to revisit. Julian called his mother himself a few days later and had a long, difficult conversation that he later summarized to me carefully but didn't share in full detail, which I respected. Some conversations between a son and his mother are theirs to have privately, even they're about events that happened to all 3 of us. What I do know is that he told her, plainly, that the form should have been updated the day we got married, that her silence about it for 4 years wasn't acceptable regardless of her intentions, and that going forward, any future medical decisions about his care belonged to me fully without ambiguity, without an old document anyone could quietly point to as an alternative. Patricia, for her part, apologized, not extravagantly, not the kind of dramatic remorse that makes for a satisfying ending, but plainly in a phone call to me about the Surrey, saying she was sorry for the way it had come out, that she should have brought it up years ago, that she hadn't meant for it to feel the way it clearly had felt to both of us in that pre-op bay. I accepted the apology because I believed by then that some real reflection had gone into it, even if I still privately doubted whether she'd have ever volunteered the update on her own, absent a surgeon's routine pre-op checklist accidentally forcing the issue into the open. I didn't need to resolve that doubt completely to move forward. I just needed the form fixed, and an honest acknowledgement that it should never have taken what it took to fix it. People who hear this story sometimes ask me whether I think Patricia was acting in bad faith the whole time. Whether I believe she deliberately, knowingly kept that old designation in place as a kind of quiet insurance policy against losing her central role in Julian's life. I've thought about this question more than almost any other part of the story, and I've landed somewhere that I think is more useful than a simple yes or no. I don't think it matters, in the end, whether her motive was calculated or simply careless, because the practical danger to Julian, and to me, was identical either way. An outdated medical proxy doesn't become less dangerous because the person benefiting from it forgot to mention it rather than scheme to keep it. The system doesn't check intentions, it just checks whatever name is on the form. That's the piece of this story I most want to leave people with, more than anything specific about Patricia or about my marriage. Most people have no idea what's sitting dormant in medical charts from years earlier. An old emergency contact from a relationship that ended, proxy designation from before a marriage or after a divorce, a form filled out quickly in a waiting room a decade ago that nobody has ever thought to revisit since. It doesn't take malice for that kind of gap to become dangerous. It just takes time, and the very ordinary, very human tendency to assume that paperwork from the past stays in the past, when in fact stays exactly where you left it, waiting for the one moment. A diagnosis, a surgery, an emergency, where it suddenly, urgently matters again. I work in hospital administration. I know how these systems work, and even I had never once thought to ask, in 4 years of marriage, whether Julian's old paperwork from a minor surgery 5 years before we met had ever been formally updated. It took a surgeon's routine pre-op checklist 90 seconds before my husband was wheeled into an operating room to surface a gap that had been sitting in his chart the entire time we'd been married. I think about how easily that checklist question could have gone differently. A different surgeon, a slightly less thorough one, who simply pulled up the existing designation without asking whether it was current, who never said the word proxy out loud in that pre-op at all. If Dr. Price hadn't asked, Patricia would never have had to say, "That's still me." She would simply have remained, silently, exactly where she'd always been on that form, and none of us would ever have known to question it, possibly for years, possibly until a moment with far less time to fix it than the 12 minutes we were lucky enough to have. I've also come to appreciate, more than I expected to, just how much that single habit, asking one more verification question than is strictly required, matters in a hospital setting, and how rarely patients or families think to ask for it themselves. I've since started recommending to every friend and coworker who tells me about an upcoming surgery for themselves or a family member that they specifically ask, during pre-op intake, exactly who is listed as their proxy, rather than assuming the question will be asked for them. Most hospitals will tell you immediately if you ask. Almost nobody asks. I certainly never had in 4 years of marriage, until a surgeon happened to ask it for us. That's what I'd want anyone hearing this story to actually take from it. Not a takedown of Patricia, exactly, though I won't pretend I've fully forgiven the silence. Something closer to a warning, the same warning I now find myself giving to friends and co-workers whenever this story comes. Go look at your own paperwork. Check who's actually listed as your proxy, your emergency contact, your decision maker, in every health system you've ever been admitted to. Especially if your life has changed since the last time you filled out that form. A marriage, a divorce, any of the changes that quietly make an old designation obsolete without anyone ever telling you so. It takes 12 minutes to fix if you catch it in time. It takes considerably longer and considerably more risk if you don't. Julian healed well. He's back to his normal life now, fully recovered, and the form in his chart says my name, clearly current, exactly where it should have said it 4 years earlier. Patricia still comes to dinner. The relationship is different now. More honest, in its own careful way, even if it's also more guarded than it used to be. And every time I think about those 12 minutes in that pre-op bay, I think less about anger and more about how close we came to never knowing, and how grateful I am, every single time, for a surgeon who asked one more question than he technically had to.